So my name is Ian Mitchell. I come to you from Kamloops, from the Royal Inland Hospital, which is about a 4-hour drive from here on the Trans-Canada. And up there, my main practice is as an emergency physician. I work about two-thirds of a full-time job as an emergency physician. I also have a research role up there. We have a program in Kamloops where we train doctors to be family medicine doctors. And I'm in charge of teaching them about research, about how to carry it on, about how to understand research and interpret it for use with their patients. And in addition, I'm an associate professor of emergency medicine at the University of British Columbia. Can everybody hear me okay? I hear there's music in the background and stuff, but everybody can hear. Great. Okay, now, so that's kind of my main job. Now, I also have some roles within the cannabis sphere. I'm a co-investigator in a study using cannabis to treat PTSD symptoms. And that's happening at UBC Okanagan in Kelowna. And it's a co-production between UBC and Tilray, who are a licensed producer of medical cannabis. I'm also on the editorial board for Using Medical Cannabis, which is a trade journal. And I'm a provider. I run a cannabis clinic up in Kamloops, where I provide people with medical cannabis. I can be found on social media on, my blog is Clinical Cannabis in Context, but I can also be found at Travels Too Little and also at McDane TBQ. Now the Travels Too Little one is a bit more focused on emergency medicine. If you're more interested in cannabis, definitely follow me at McDane TBQ. It's more my cannabis website. The slide deck for this presentation, along with extra information, you can find on either one of those timelines, the Travels Too Little or the McDane TBQ. And there's a slide deck there with a lot of extra information or the articles that help me to write that. So if you're interested in some further reading, you can find more information there. So the myths and realities. We're coming into a stage of recreational cannabis legalization in Canada. And one of the major concerns is Carmageddon. Will there be carnage on the highways? What kind of disaster are we going to be facing come July of 2018? And I don't think that's going to happen because we really haven't seen it here. We haven't seen it in Vancouver. You know, Vancouver, there's been a massive rise in dispensaries, and not all those people are staying off the roads. And we really haven't seen a lot of increase in accidents. So if we go to more kind of population state data, the first thing we hear is don't panic. Because we have to look down to the south. We have to look down to America, to some places where this has actually taken place. So in Colorado and Washington are both states where there has been legalization of recreational cannabis. And there's 2 studies that have come out from that, looking at whether or not there's been an increase in accidents. And one study showed there was really no increase at all in the rate of accidents pre and post legalization. And a different study showed there was a 3% increase. So a minor one, but not insignificant. So those are the studies we have. Now, what you're going to hear from prohibitionists, from people who are a little bit more concerned, is they're going to tell you that the rates of cannabis-associated fatalities have doubled, okay? And this isn't quite true. It's a bit of a manipulation of statistics. What they're saying is that we found, of all the people who died in car accidents, more of them were positive for cannabis. But that's kind of what you expect in an area where they've legalized cannabis. What you're saying is there's more people who test positive for the drug, but there's no evidence that that drug led to impairment in those cases. And for that data, we have to go a little bit further into some different kind of information. There's a current campaign on right now by Public Safety Canada, and among the statistics they quote is they say that using cannabis can increase the risk of being in a crash by 100%. It doubles your risk. And I don't think that's true. And I think there's good evidence to show that that isn't true. So let's look a little bit at that evidence. And I have to take a little moment here just to talk about some statistics, which is a little bit boring, but it's really important to understand the context of the risks that we're talking about here. And I'm going to use as an example a recent study that came out of France looking at cannabis, alcohol, and traffic accidents. And what they showed was that there was a risk of being in an accident after using cannabis. The risk was 1.65. And what that means is there's an increased risk of 65%. So your normal risk is 100%. You normally have a risk of being in an accident every time you leave the house. Might be 1 in 1,000, might be 1 in 10,000, not usually very high. But it is increased if you've used cannabis. Thinking how much exactly, we're unclear, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But with an RR of 1.65, that translates into an increased risk of 65%. Now, just from comparison, in that same study, the relative risk of being in an accident after consuming alcohol was 17.8, or an increased risk of 1,680%. Or another way to look at it is the increased risk is 25 times that of marijuana. Okay? So much, much more impairing. Now, this is all comers. It's not attempting to break down the alcohol level by blood alcohol. And this is an attempt, this is data from the National Institute of Health, looking at the increased risk to driving from alcohol alone. And what you'll see is that the risk starts off at 1, drops slightly, and we're not sure why that is, but then very quickly goes up. And you're looking at risks of about 18 to 20 times when you get up to level of 0.2. But even for a level of 0.04 or 0.05, that's associated with significant increase in risk. This is one way of breaking it down. This comes from European data, looking at different substances in driving. And what they found was that cannabis really falls into the same area as having a blood alcohol level of 0.01 to 0.05, what we consider to be legal in Canada. As you go up with alcohol level, your risk goes up precipitously. And this graph is more about the very lower blood alcohol levels. And what I've done is I've just plotted those along here. So going up here is increased risk. And if you look at what's legal at 0.05, the doubling of risk, even the worst figures show that we don't get to an impairment level as much as 0.05 alcohol when using cannabis. So the studies they're quoting from Public Safety Canada are the Asbridge and Lee studies. And those are a little bit dated right now. And what happened in 2016, a paper was published by a group of statisticians in Norway, and that's this ELVIC number. And they found that instead of 100%, the risk of driving after using cannabis was only about 35%, 25 to 30%. Because those old studies had used data that was full of errors. They made some misattributions in their data. There were some things that weren't considered. So these statisticians cleaned it up and added some extra studies that have been done since then and came up with a considerably lower risk. We've also, somewhat problematically, had a couple of studies that really didn't show any risk from driving. Now that's, I think in those cases, they weren't able to tell it. But what it does show is it probably isn't a very big effect. And really when we get down to it, we got a couple more recent studies that really put it up at kind of 60% risk. So I really think overall, when you consider all these studies, the overall increased risk from cannabis is probably about 50%, and probably similar to an alcohol level of about 0.03. So why do we care about risk? What what difference does it make if I say it increases the risk by 100% or 60%? Well, a lot of these figures get used in further studies. So one study published in 2012 using the doubling of risk calculated that 75 people a year die from accidents involving cannabis. But that's using the doubling figure. So if we use a figure of 25%, 35%, deaths would be much lower. And all that has effects on public policy, what we spend our money on to prevent drunk driving or impaired driving from any cause. So it is ultimately important to figure out the relative dangers of each of these substances and behaviors. There's certainly other things when we drive. We all want to be the best driver we can. should have all rested well, should have taken our caffeine before starting driving to make us absolute best. But that's not reality. That's not what really happens in life. If you are a senior who always drives with a pet in your car, your increased risk of accident is 89%. Zopiclone is a very common sleeping medication in Canada. Usually comes as a 7.5 milligram tablet. If you take that tablet at night, you should not drive for 12 hours after. You should not drive in the morning. And Health Canada put out that warning to Canadians because in the morning, your level of impairment is equivalent to someone with a 0.05 to 0.08 blood alcohol level. And there's people that take 2 of those pills, they shouldn't drive the next day, period. If you're eating, it increases your risk by about 70%. Obviously, that's different if you're taking a Smartie every now and then versus cooking on a hibachi beside you. Young drivers, just from the get-go, if you're an 18-year-old male, you're at a much higher risk of getting an accident than a 50-year-old woman. And that just comes with experience. But even for a young driver with a passenger in the car, increases your risk by 60 to 80%. Opiates alone, high-dose opiates, increase your risk by 40%. But we don't do breathalyzers for them. We're not testing blood for them. But we've got an opiate crisis on their hands. There's lots of people taking it. So we're just ignoring that problem? Is that what we're doing here? Benadryl is another common one. Benadryl is found in a lot of medications that we use to help people sleep at night over the counter. And in a survey of Vancouver drivers who were injured in the morning, very high rates of Benadryl in their blood. So that's another medication that's carrying on. Nobody expects that impaired driving is a thing that happens in the morning, but it's out there. This is a huge, huge myth and a problem. There's several provinces in Canada that are going to have per se laws, meaning that if you have any level of THC in your blood, you will be forbidden to drive. This makes no scientific sense. The Automobile Association of America has said that. The National Highway Transport and Safety Association in America has said that. There's all kinds of organizations that have come out and said, look, the THC level does not correlate with the level of impairment. So you can measure the level of drug, but that doesn't tell you anything about impairment, which is really the problem we're trying to solve. So it just answers a different question than what we want to know the answer to. Now, among all this information, there's also some studies that challenge this narrative about cannabis and driving. One of the interesting findings, we're talking about drivers and cannabis, but what about the passengers who are there, if they've been using cannabis? And there's a couple of really interesting studies that are quite thought-provoking about survival after being in an accident. And one a couple of years ago was looking specifically at traumatic brain injury and found quite significant increase in survival compared to those who were not positive for cannabis. Again, this says nothing about impairment, says nothing about when they used it, just that they were positive. It seemed to help them survive. Another study more recently, looking at all the comers for ICU trauma, again found significant survival advantage for those people who had used cannabis prior to being in their accident. The most challenging of all of this research comes from a research duo called Reese and Anderson. And about 2011, they did a study that showed that in states that had legalized medical marijuana, the accident fatality rate dropped by about 9% consistently over states. And what they were able to tie that to was they were able to tie that to a decrease in binge drinking and a decrease in beer sales. So this becomes the crux of the matter as far as public health safety in Canada. If we can convince more people to stop drinking and use cannabis as a recreational substitute, we could see our traffic fatality rates drop because you're moving from a very, very impairing substance to a less impairing substance. Now, that's not going to take place if people just decide they're going to do both. That's not better for you. They each produce impairment in different ways, so impairment with two substances is clearly worse than just with one. So those are the myths, and now it's time to get to the reality. What's going to happen in July? How are we going to deal with this problem? Police stations or police organizations are already kind of saying, we don't have enough people trained, we don't have enough devices. They're all like about these breathalyzer devices. But the ultimate thing is responsibility. It is our responsibility. It's my responsibility as a physician to properly counsel my patients. But even when we move out into recreational, it is the responsibility of the consumer to ensure that you are not impaired when you go out. And I don't think, even from all I was saying before, that it's not that impairing. That's not a proviso to say, hey, take some big bong rips and go driving. That's not what I'm up here saying. I'm saying it's less impairing than what people think, but I'm not saying it's not impairing. So we need to take responsibility ourselves for this. So I mentioned the breathalyzer devices, and I see so many articles written about police officers getting these and trying these out and adapting for use in Canada, and it just doesn't matter. I can't believe so much money is being wasted, so much time is being wasted on developing these devices that show the presence of a drug. They don't show the presence of an impairment. Okay. So again, they're answering the wrong question that we have. And so far, we don't have any evidence of breathalyzers that can distinguish between old use and new use. And we don't have any breathalyzers that can tell us anything about impairment, which is really the thing we want to know about. Drug recognition experts are the next kind of thing on the pyramid. They're really expensive to train and to keep on. There's not that many of them. And to do a proper examination takes about half an hour. So not super practical by the side of the road, out in the cold. If you got to kind of get through 300 people, this just is not going to be useful to you. So of course there's an app for that. So there's a couple of apps. One's called Druid, and one is called My Canary. And these are apps that will let you play around with them. Druid, I know a little bit more about. It's got 4 different exercises in it to do, and it tests your hand-eye coordination, tests your reaction time, tests your perception of time. Just as an example, one of the exercises involves holding onto something solid, raising an arm, holding your device out at hand's length, and then it just measures the movement in that. And that's just testing your coordination. And that's one of the exercises. So with that, what you do is you do a whole bunch of baseline tests, find out what your normal is, and then at different times, if you've ingested alcohol or cannabis, you can do a self-test and see where you stand. Now, it's not going to tell you you're safe to drive, but it'll tell you you're not safe to drive. So I think there's a lot of impetus for research into this area. I think we really need to go forward with this kind of testing. I was down in Granville Island yesterday, and my son had a virtual reality experience on a roller coaster kind of thing. He got motion sick. But again, that's the kind of thing where you could take out to road stops, strap onto people's head. Every language is there. It's something they're familiar with from driving tests, that then you can actually test the impairment rather than the blood levels. So I think this is really the way it's going to be moving, because we ultimately need a test for impairment that is less discriminatory. And I think the breathalyzer is just going to fail on constitutional grounds alone. Now, kind of the problem with this is there's probably a lot of people impaired already out there on the road from other things. Maybe they're withdrawing. Maybe they're old. Maybe their eyes aren't so good. And we do a bit of testing at at the Driver's License Bureau, but we don't do a lot of real physical testing. And one of the concerns I have with this is if we're testing for impairment, we might find a lot of people who are impaired not from drugs, but just from physical disability. And how do we get around that? And then maybe the ultimate solution for all this is autonomous cars. My wife makes fun of me for thinking that. But I think we have this perception now that impairment and driving are pretty much okay. I come from a fairly rural environment. We've got lots of pubs that have very big parking lots. And people are in rural communities and they go back and forth. So ultimately we're going to have to find a solution. I have 9 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? I think there's going to be someone walking around with a microphone there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the very informative lecture. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now.
Thank you for the very informative lecture. I was wondering, have you been involved with proposals for the task force? Have you put in communication with the government?
No, I haven't been involved with that. This actually came out of a talk I gave about a year ago for the trauma service in interior health, just about drugs and driving, and that's how my interest came up. But I don't have any, I didn't make any submissions. I'm not really involved with the task force.
Okay, I will.
No, and I think, yeah, we need to get this information out because, I mean, governments have to be conservative, but they're using really much more conservative figures than they should. There's an article that was published in the Leaf that I did with Solomon Israel, just talking about Public Safety Canada and their claims.
Fantastic presentation. You actually presented information I didn't know yet, and I've been going on about this. And my concern is what was mentioned is that we have these laws, Bill C-46 in particular, that are designed to target people for cannabis use. The presentation that you made would be extremely valuable, I think, when they review this legislation. Are you making efforts to reach out to them, to the government, to try and present this, or are you able to be an expert witness or testimony in legal challenges that will surely be arising in the years ahead?
I haven't done any legal work in that area. I do a little bit of WCB work right now for disability and that type of thing. I'm very interested in kind of taking part in this. I'm in Cam, so it kind of puts me a little bit away from some of the action sometimes. I know. Yeah, I'm very much trying to be a part of this conversation because I think there is elements that are missing here. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you again for your presentation. I'm curious. I'm a medicinal cannabis user and I drive.
Yeah.
Okay, and I use it every day. I have fibromyalgia.
This is a really legitimate question. So ultimately, I think it comes down to the same question as opiates or, say, Valium kind of thing. In no way should someone take morphine for the first time and then go driving. That's dumb. And the same way, if you just ate a big brownie for the first time, you don't go driving. But we know that people who are on opiates eventually can be safe drivers. They get used to the symptoms and they know when they should and shouldn't drive. So I think that comes with experience. But I think now we actually have tools that you can test yourself now and see. And if you're at a state where you're like, oh, I thought I could drive and now I'm not, that's probably a good realization for everybody to know about. There's a guy in the back there. Oh.
Thank you. The issue for me isn't whether I think I'm impaired when I'm driving, it's am I impaired? What's going to happen if I get pulled over and get charged?
Absolutely. So ultimately, if you are impaired, you should be penalized. I think that's fairly straightforward. But the question is, are you impaired? So right now, we've got cases where there's a case of the Saanich moms. So first day of school, there's this minivan pulled over for speeding in a school area. And the smoke's basically billowing out the windows. The moms had just dropped their kids off for the first day at school, lit up a celebratory joint. Okay, so stopped by police. Police officer gets out and they get a drug recognition expert. So they're almost certain this woman has recently smoked cannabis, but they can't prove impairment with a drug recognition expert. So I think that's what we have to get through. And we're seeing that we've already seen that coming out with alcohol with the 0.05 level. There have been court challenges say, at 0.05, I wasn't impaired. I did nothing wrong. So we're still fighting that out, and we're going to be fighting that out in a big way over these per se laws because they really don't show any level of impairment at all. It's only just about the drug in your system, and that's never going to fly constitutionally.
Hi, I'm just curious about the. Oh, better. I'm curious about the roadside tests and the breathalyzer. In the breathalyzer for alcohol, does it show the impairment? Is it able to discern it?
It doesn't. So the thing about alcohol is that alcohol is a very unique drug. As the level goes up, your impairment goes up, and it's very straightforward. And if you test anybody at that blood level, they're pretty similarly impaired. And we've got great data to support that. The problem is that doesn't really apply to pretty much any other drug. Because of tolerance, I guess you just never really get that tolerant the effects of alcohol. But for opiates, for benzodiazepines, all kinds of other drugs, the level really doesn't relate to the impairment. So we've been able in the past to use blood alcohol level, use that chemical level as a proxy for impairment because it does work in the lab, but it doesn't hold true for any other substance that we know of. So that's really the problem.
Okay, thank. Something that has come up with another method of detection of impairment is the eyes in the pupils with a dilation of it.
Absolutely, that's a big part of the impairment testing for sure.
Is that something that can be used for the drugs, regardless of what the drug is, instead of just alcohol?
Yeah, so certainly eye testing is a big component of drug testing. That's one of the things they do with the police. So using a virtual reality helmet is one way they could do that, and looking at your eye tracking. There's a group in the States that's looking at this helmet that does kind of instant brain imaging that's looking for impairment. But I think ultimately you want to see practical, real time, what people's impairment is. If they can't do a simple task and you can record that, that's evidence of impairment. Good. Okay, one more there.
Hi there. I'm not holding you to this, but could you give us a generalization as in, okay, if I smoke a joint, wait 2 hours, is there any type of, once this is legal, I want to have a little bit of an idea.
So those values range from about 3 to 6 hours, depending on who you read, and none of it is based on any solid evidence. So it's really expert opinion at this time. I think that the Druid app is actually a good way to calculate, and you can kind of measure your impairment as it drops. So at some point you're going to be safe to drive. So I think that's the way to go. For a study, I think we recommend people wait at least 3 hours. But is that based on good evidence? Not at all. Okay, I think this will probably be my last question here. Maybe take one more question. Oh, yeah, I got one over here. Sorry.
I lived in a resort municipality for 15 years, and through those years met a lot of Australians who explained their roadside testing. Are you familiar with those practices? Because I've heard various stories on how it works with the mouth swab and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so they're doing some interesting stuff there with roadside driving. I'm not that familiar with what they're doing right at the moment, and they're really going for more the per se limits there, and I think that's really problematic. And they're just introducing that for cocaine as well. Okay, last question.
Don't point the mic towards the stage, okay?
Okay. Is there any way that we could maybe run a test, a nationwide test?
I think with this app or something like that, I'd love to see some crowdsourcing going on. I'd like to see some real research carried on, because I think this is the way forward for everybody. So I think, if we can get maybe one of the licensed boosters to sign on and support that, could be something that happens. Anyway, I'm about out of time. Thank you so much for coming and listening and asking great questions. And I hope this was interesting, educational. Thank you.